He wasn't just wild. He was a legend before anyone ever laid hands on him. Locals called him Blaze, a name earned not just from the white streak running down his face, but from the fire in his eyes, the way he tore through the high desert of northern Nevada like he owned it. Ranchers swore they'd seen him outrun pickup trucks, leap barbed wire fences like they weren't even there, and lead entire herds of Mustangs away from helicopters during roundups. He was faster, smarter, and angrier than any wild horse they'd ever seen, and no one could catch him. For 3 years, Blaze evaded capture, until the day the sky filled with rotors and his luck ran out. It took 4 choppers, a dozen riders on ATVs, and a network of temporary fencing stretched across 10 miles to trap him and his herd. They say the dust cloud could be seen from the nearest town, and the sound of his hooves striking steel gates echoed like thunder through the valley. When they finally forced him into a holding pen, he didn't settle like the others. He kicked, he reared, he slammed his body into the walls until his chest bled. Every time a wrangler tried to approach, he lashed out, biting, striking, breaking halters and gate locks. One handler lost 2 fingers. Another ended up in the ICU with fractured ribs. By the end of the week, Blaze had been moved to a reinforced isolation pen, marked with red tape and a handwritten sign, "Dangerous, no entry without authorization." Trainers came from out of state, drawn by the challenge and the rumors. None lasted more than a day. One tried to rope train him. Blaze dragged him 40 feet across gravel. Another attempted a pressure and release method. Blaze leapt a 6-foot rail and bolted through the yard before anyone could blink. When the third trainer ended up unconscious with a concussion, the bureau overseeing his case had seen enough. He was labeled unfit for rehabilitation. His file was marked with 3 words, final disposition pending. And in that world, that meant one thing: slaughter. Sell him for meat overseas, make back a few dollars, end the story. But Blaze wasn't just a horse. He was fury. He was freedom. He was 1,000 pounds of unbroken will that refused to be boxed in, caged, or forced to kneel. And somewhere deep beneath that rage, there was something else. Something no one had taken the time to see. Not yet. Not until fate intervened. Not until a quiet, grieving girl with pain in her eyes and no words left to speak stepped into his story and changed everything. The silence in Lily's world wasn't empty, it was deafening. It pressed in on her like a weight, thick and unmoving, and no one knew how to lift it. Not the school counselors who tried coaxing words from her with flashcards and soft voices. Not the therapists with their exercises and questions and hopeful smiles. And not her remaining family, who whispered from the hallway and shut doors a little too quietly, as if sound itself might hurt her. She hadn't spoken a single word since the accident. 14 months of silence, not even a whisper, not even a nod the first few weeks. Just blank eyes and stillness. Her voice hadn't been lost, it had been buried, locked somewhere far behind the memory of twisted metal, broken glass, and the sirens that screamed louder than she ever could. Her parents had taken her on a weekend road trip through the mountains. They were singing in the car. She remembered that part. The song, her mother's voice, her father tapping the steering wheel. And then, nothing but impact. She'd been pulled from the wreck by strangers, still strapped into the back seat, miraculously without a single broken bone, physically untouched. But the girl who stepped out of that ambulance wasn't the same one who'd climbed into the car 2 hours earlier. She stopped speaking that day, and the more people tried to bring her back, the farther she seemed to drift. Her world became smaller and smaller, until it fit neatly inside a suitcase and a sketchbook. Her grandfather, Tom Reynolds, wasn't ready for a 10-year-old girl with trauma buried deeper than most adults could comprehend. A retired rancher with creaky knees and calloused hands, he lived alone on a struggling horse sanctuary nestled in the high plains of Idaho. He'd spent the last few years saving what others threw away: broken-down geldings, overbred mares, wild ones too rough for the auction block. His ranch was quiet, slow, and steady. Not the kind of place built for raising a child, But when the court named him Lily's guardian, he didn't hesitate. "She'll have a roof, she'll have meals, and she'll have peace," he told the social worker. That was all he could promise. Lily arrived with only one small duffel bag and the hollow look of someone older than her years. Her hair was neatly brushed, but her eyes carried no light. She didn't cry, didn't cling, didn't flinch. She simply stood still while adults talked around her. Tom tried not to hover. He didn't know much about child psychology, but he knew enough about horses to understand that pressure only pushes the broken further away. So he gave her space. He made her room her own. He left crayons and paper beside her bed. He taught her how to feed the gentlest of his rescues through the fence. And every night, without fail, he sat across from her at the kitchen table and told a story. Sometimes about her father as a boy, sometimes about an old ranch horse with a funny name, sometimes about her grandmother who used to sing to the horses in the barn like they were churchgoers. Lily never reacted, never looked up, but she listened. He could see that much. It was the horses who reached her first, not with words, with presence. There was Daisy, the blind mare who pressed her muzzle against Lily's arm one morning and simply stood there. There was Pistol, the retired barrel horse who followed her along the fence line like a loyal dog. And there was the endless rhythm of hooves, the sounds of breath and snorts, and the soft rustle of hay. Tom noticed she'd begun to draw again. First shapes, then horses. Always from a distance. No people, no words, just motionless girls and towering, proud horses. She spent her days wandering between paddocks with her sketchbook, never entering the stalls, never touching a halter, but always nearby, always watching. Sometimes she'd just sit in the tall grass, as still as the statues she drew. In the silence, the sanctuary became her world, and though she didn't speak, she was never really alone. Tom kept trying gently. He'd leave fresh apples on her plate. He'd call out when a foal was born. He even set up a small bench under the big cottonwood tree by the fence line, just for her. But deep down, he feared the silence would never lift, that whatever had closed off his granddaughter's voice had sealed itself too tight for anything, even love, to break through. And then the letter came from the Nevada auction. A horse no one wanted, a danger to every human it met, a last chance being offered to one final home before the unthinkable. Tom read the report twice, then looked out at Lily, sitting quietly by Daisy's stall, sketchbook in hand, head tilted in thought. He didn't know why, but something stirred, a wild, reckless thought he hadn't let himself believe in years. He circled the date on the calendar, a broken horse, a broken child, and a sanctuary where maybe, just maybe, both could find something they'd forgotten how to need. Hope. The sky over Elko was the color of rust when Tom pulled into the auction yard, the rising dust clinging to his truck like old regrets. He hadn't planned on this, hadn't budgeted for it, didn't even know what he was going to say when he got there. But something about the description of that horse, the wild brown Mustang that had shattered gates and terrified wranglers, got under his skin. The more he read, the more it itched. And not because he was looking for another rescue. He already had too many mouths to feed, too many fences to patch, and too many vet bills stacked in the desk drawer he hadn't opened in 3 weeks. But this horse, this Blaze, wasn't just another troubled animal. There was something deeper in those reports, a pattern, not of defiance, but of fear, not mindless rage, but pain, like the world had cornered him one too many times, and now he bit first just to keep it from happening again. Tom had seen that before, not in horses, in people. The auction office smelled of coffee gone stale and boots that had tracked in 100 miles of mud. The man behind the counter didn't look up when Tom stepped in. "If you're here for the paint gelding, he's already spoken for," he grunted. "I'm not," Tom replied. "I'm here about the Mustang." That made the man pause. "You mean that one?" he said, raising an eyebrow and thumbing through a clipboard thick with warnings. "BLM, tag number Nititusen Suvhundra Ofemti Tre. Brown coat, white Blaze, fractured 2 ribs on a handler last month." "That's the one," Tom nodded. "You sure you're in the right place, old-timer?" the man said, half joking. "This ain't a rescue case. That animal's got nothing but hell in him. 3 placements, 3 failures. The last trainer left him locked in a steel box and said he'd rather wrestle a grizzly. No one wants him. Hell, he's scheduled for transport to a processing facility next week. It's done." Tom didn't flinch. "I want to see him." They walked across the gravel lot, past rows of horses standing with their heads low and eyes dulled from days of confinement. Then they reached the end of the pens, where the concrete base was thicker, the bars taller, and a double set of gates reinforced the perimeter. Inside stood Blaze, or rather, a storm coiled in the shape of a horse. His coat glistened with sweat, though the morning air was cool. His nostrils flared as he tracked their every step, one ear forward, one back. Not a blink, not a twitch of peace, just pure, simmering tension. "Don't get too close," the man warned. "He knows exactly how far he can strike, and he will." Tom didn't move. He studied the animal in silence, letting the moment stretch. Blaze stood his ground, unmoving but alive with electricity, like the charge before lightning. He was lean, powerful, scarred in places that told stories no human had written down. And behind those wild eyes, intelligence, not just instinct, thought. "How much?" Tom asked finally, still not taking his eyes off the horse. "You're serious? You said no one else wants him." "Yeah, but I'm not about to give him away and end up getting sued when he kills someone." "I'm not asking you to," Tom said. "How much to take him off your hands?" The man sighed, scratched his head, and rattled off a number, far less than any horse with Blaze's build and bloodline would normally fetch. But it wasn't about value. It was about liability, about washing their hands of a problem before it became a headline. "No returns," the man added, "no refunds, and no help when it goes wrong. This one's your funeral, old man." "Noted," Tom said, and signed the papers. The drive home was long, and Blaze made it feel longer. The trailer rocked every few minutes with his weight slamming from side to side. At one point, Tom had to pull over just to check the locks. The Mustang was throwing himself against the walls, eyes white-rimmed with panic, the metal groaning under each blow. "You're not trying to get out," Tom muttered under his breath, standing at a distance and watching the chaos inside. "You're trying to make sure nobody gets in." He didn't try to soothe him, didn't speak nonsense into the air like some trainers did. He just waited, let the horse wear himself down a little, then drove the rest of the way in silence. It was near dusk when the truck rolled up the sanctuary's dirt road, the tires crunching in the gravel like a warning bell. Lily stood on the porch, her sketchbook in hand, watching without expression. She didn't move as Tom stepped out and made his way to the trailer. He waved at her briefly, then turned his full attention to the trembling, furious animal inside. Getting Blaze from the trailer into the reinforced paddock took patience, grit, and every bit of experience Tom had ever earned in 60 years of handling horses. He didn't use a whip, didn't raise his voice, just kept his posture neutral, his movements slow, and his gait wide open, until Blaze bolted into the enclosure, spun once, then stood at the far end, chest heaving, eyes wild. Tom locked the gate behind him and exhaled, not with relief, but with responsibility. This was no longer someone else's problem. This was his now. As he turned to go, he saw Lily had come a few steps closer, not to the paddock, just to the edge of the porch. Her eyes weren't on him. They were fixed on the Mustang, wide, curious, not afraid. She said nothing, of course, just watched, and the strangest thing happened. Blaze watched her too, not like he watched the men with ropes or the hands with whips, not like prey, more like recognition. That night, Tom sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he never finished. The rain started tapping against the windows, soft and steady. Across the room, Lily sat curled up in the corner with a blanket around her shoulders. She hadn't drawn since Blaze arrived. She hadn't even opened her sketchbook, but she'd been outside longer than usual, closer to the paddock than she'd gone before, watching. Tom rubbed his hands over his face and stared out the window into the dark. "What the hell have I done?" he whispered, not expecting an answer. Not from Lily, not from God, but outside, somewhere in the wind and wet, a wild horse stood awake in a pen not meant to hold his kind, and a silent girl sat in her chair, eyes open wide to a storm that might just bring something back neither of them had expected, something they'd both lost long ago. The first time it happened, Tom thought he was seeing things. It was early, so early the sun hadn't yet cleared the eastern ridge, and the sky was still holding on to the last of the stars. He stepped outside with a thermos of black coffee, expecting the usual: silence, dew on the fence rails, maybe a restless snort from the barn. But what he saw instead made him stop in his tracks. Lily, wrapped in her old patchwork jacket, was sitting cross-legged in the grass 20 feet from Blaze's paddock, alone, unmoving, no sketchbook in her hands, just her and the Mustang. Blaze stood near the back fence, head high, muscles tense, watching her with the same wary stillness she watched him. Neither moved, neither blinked. For a moment it looked like some kind of standoff, two wild things testing the distance between them. But there was no fear in Lily's face, and no threat in Blaze's, just silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Tom didn't interrupt. He stayed on the porch, leaning against the post, letting his coffee go cold. He didn't know what this was, but he recognized instinct when he saw it. And whatever was happening out there between the girl and the Mustang, it wasn't something to interfere with. It was delicate, fragile, like trying to catch a butterfly in a windstorm. So he watched. And for nearly an hour, neither of them moved. The next morning, it happened again. This time, Tom found Lily already outside when he woke up. She was in the same spot, same position, eyes fixed on the paddock. Blaze again stood at a distance, not pacing, not charging the fence like he usually did when anyone got close, just watching her. By the third morning, Tom had stopped being surprised. A routine had formed, silent and strange. Every day, Lily would slip out of the house just after dawn, before chores, before breakfast, and take her place in the grass. Blaze would do the same, waiting, watching, unmoving. No words were exchanged, no gestures. But something was building in that stillness. It wasn't training, it wasn't therapy. It wasn't anything Tom had ever seen in 6 decades of working with horses. It was something quieter, older, like they were learning to speak a language that had no sound, only presence. Other horses noticed too. Pistol would occasionally wander to his side of the fence, nicker in confusion, and wander off. Daisy would stop chewing and glance over with one blind eye, sensing something her body couldn't see. But Blaze remained locked onto Lily, and Lily remained anchored to him. It was like time itself didn't matter when they were in that field. Minutes passed, then hours. Sometimes Tom would call Lily in for breakfast and get no response. Not because she was ignoring him, but because whatever was happening out there between her and that horse ran deeper than hunger or habit. On the 5th day, something changed. It was subtle, almost invisible, but Tom caught it. Blaze took a step forward. Just one. Not a charge, not a threat, just one cautious, deliberate step toward the girl sitting in the grass. His ears were up, his nostrils flared, but not in fear. He was reading the moment like she was. And Lily, she didn't flinch. She didn't reach out or even move. She simply stayed where she was, letting him decide the pace. And after a minute, he took another step, then another. He didn't come close, not really. He stopped a dozen feet away, breathing heavily, legs stiff with tension, but he didn't back away. And for a horse like Blaze, that was everything. That evening, Tom sat Lily down with a notepad and gently asked if she wanted to write something about the horse, a feeling, a thought, a name. She took the pencil, considered for a long moment, and then slowly wrote one word: safe. Tom didn't press for more. He simply nodded, folded the paper, and tucked it into his wallet. From then on, the pattern deepened. Blaze began to wait for Lily each morning. He'd be standing near the front of the paddock when she came outside, ears pricked, head raised. Sometimes he'd pace until she sat. Other times, he'd already be waiting in stillness. Lily began to bring her sketchbook again, but she rarely drew Blaze directly. Instead, she drew shapes, light, movement, patterns that looked like wind across water. Whatever she saw in him, it wasn't fear anymore. Even Tom began to notice the change in the horse. Blaze had stopped charging the fence when anyone approached. He still didn't tolerate other handlers near his paddock, but the feral panic in his eyes was fading. His coat started to shine again. He began eating more regularly, drinking from the trough without glancing around every second. Small things. But in Tom's world, those small things meant survival. They meant hope. One morning, while fixing a broken latch on the tack shed, Tom heard something he hadn't heard in months. A sound so small, so soft, he nearly missed it. It was Lily, laughing, just once, just a short burst, like a surprised breath that turned into joy before she could stop it. Tom peeked around the corner and saw her sitting by the fence, knees tucked to her chest, watching as Blaze pawed the ground playfully, almost like he was trying to show off. The horse reared halfway, not a threat, just a dance, and Lily laughed again. Tom wiped his eyes and told himself it was just the wind. That night, as he sat alone in the kitchen, flipping through overdue bills and sanctuary notes, he caught himself smiling. Not because things were easier. They weren't. He still didn't know how he was going to afford the next feed order, still had a broken water line in stall 3, still had old scars of his own that hadn't quite healed, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't staring down the weight of all of it alone. Out in the paddock, under the stars, a Mustang once marked for destruction stood quietly beside the fence, and inside the house, a child once swallowed by silence was starting to breathe again. Neither of them had said a word, but both of them had been heard. It started with a storm, not the kind that drifts in gently or gives you time to close windows and bring in tools. This one rolled over the mountains like an avalanche of sky, fast and furious, with winds that howled through the valleys and lightning that lit up the sanctuary like a battlefield. Tom had seen plenty of bad weather in his life, but this one was different. It felt charged, unpredictable, like something bigger was about to break loose. He was in the barn, struggling to fasten a stubborn latch on the hay door, when the first crack of thunder shook the rafters. The horses reacted instantly. Pistol began circling his stall, snorting. Daisy stomped nervously in the corner. Even the colts, usually too young to care about anything but their next meal, were wide-eyed and alert. And Blaze, he was losing control. Tom saw it from the moment he stepped outside. The Mustang was a storm inside a storm, muscles rippling with panic, eyes rolling white as he charged from one end of the paddock to the other. He wouldn't go near the shelter, wouldn't slow down, wouldn't hear anything over the memory roaring through his blood. It wasn't just thunder to him, it was helicopters, choppers slicing the sky, rounding up his herd, splitting families, driving him into metal traps. Every flash of lightning was a flashback, every boom a memory of being hunted. He slammed against the fence, hooves churning mud, trying to escape something long gone but still alive in his bones. Tom cursed under his breath and grabbed a halter, fully aware it would do no good. He couldn't get near Blaze on a calm day. What chance did he have now? But the horse was going to hurt himself if he kept this up. Already, blood streaked down his forehead from a fresh gash just above his eye. The paddock's fencing groaned under the constant assault. Another hit like that, and the post might give. Tom was halfway across the yard when he saw a flash of yellow out of the corner of his eye. It was Lily. She wasn't wearing shoes, just socks soaked through with rain, and her yellow raincoat buttoned crooked. She was running, toward the paddock, toward the panic. "Lily, no!" Tom shouted, his heart seizing in his chest, but the wind ripped the words from his mouth before they could reach her. She was already at the gate, small hands fumbling with the latch as Blaze thundered past, oblivious to her presence. Tom sprinted, legs slower than they used to be, lungs already burning. "Stop!" he yelled again, this time with more fear than force. "Get back! That's not safe!" But Lily didn't stop. She stepped inside the paddock. The world seemed to pause, just for a breath. just long enough for Tom to feel the bottom drop out of his stomach. Blaze froze mid-gallop, hooves sinking into the mud, nostrils flaring as he locked eyes with the small figure standing in the storm. Lily didn't run, didn't shout. She just stood there, soaked and shivering, her arms hanging loosely by her sides. Then she did something no one expected. She sat down. Right there in the mud, in the middle of the chaos, Lily folded her legs beneath her and lowered her head. Not in fear, in surrender. She made herself smaller, gentler. She didn't challenge the Mustang's space, didn't reach for him. She just existed beside him, offering nothing but calm in a moment when everything else screamed for panic. And Blaze, he didn't charge. He stood still, quivering, chest heaving, rain pelting his coat. But he didn't move toward her, and more importantly, he didn't run away. He watched. His ears flicked forward, his tail twitched, his wild eyes began to soften, just slightly, as if the storm outside had given way to a different kind of storm inside, one he didn't understand, but couldn't ignore. Then Lily did something that broke Tom completely. She started to hum. It was low, almost inaudible over the wind, a lullaby her mother used to sing when thunder rattled the windows at night. Tom recognized it immediately, and so, apparently, did Lily. It came out shaky, halting, the voice of someone unused to sound, but it was music all the same, and Blaze heard it. He took one step forward, then another, each one careful, slow, deliberate, as though approaching a fire that might burn or save him. His nostrils flared again, taking in her scent, tasting the truth of her calm. He lowered his head ever so slightly, not in submission, in something closer to curiosity, maybe trust. Tom had made it to the fence by now, soaked through, breath caught in his throat, afraid to speak, afraid to move. He knew better than to intervene. Any sudden motion might snap the thread forming between the two of them. So he stood still, one hand clenched around the cold metal rail, watching a miracle unfold in slow motion. Blaze took one final step and stopped less than 5 feet from Lily, his hooves squished in the mud, his cut still trickled blood down his brow. But he didn't rear, didn't flee. He simply stood, listening. When Lily looked up and met his eyes, she slowly raised her hand, not to reach, not to command, just to offer. Palm open, still humming, still quiet, still impossibly brave. Blaze hesitated for a long moment. Then, in a movement so gentle it looked accidental, he extended his neck and pressed his muzzle against her palm. It was the first touch, the first voluntary contact, not coerced, not forced, chosen. Tom covered his mouth with his hand to keep from crying out loud. His knees buckled a little, but he stayed upright. Lily closed her eyes, still humming. Blaze kept his head there, resting against her hand, trembling not from fear, but from something that felt dangerously close to peace. Eventually, the rain began to ease, the wind slowed, the lightning moved off toward the next valley, the storm passed. But something else had settled in its wake, a stillness so deep it felt sacred. Tom opened the gate slowly, approaching with cautious reverence. Blaze didn't spook, he didn't even flinch. He lifted his head and turned slightly, but stayed rooted beside Lily. She stood then, mud-streaked and soaked through, and turned to face her grandfather. Her eyes were wide, not in fear, but in wonder. And then, as casually as if it had never been gone, her voice returned. "He's not angry," she said quietly. "He's just scared." Tom dropped to his knees, right there in the mud, and let the tears fall, not just for what had happened, but for what it meant, for the possibility that healing doesn't always come from pushing or pulling, from fixing or forcing. Sometimes it comes from sitting still in the storm, from listening, from offering your silence to someone who's only ever known noise, from one scared soul to another. And in that storm-soaked paddock, a horse who'd once been labeled dangerous and a girl who'd once been called unreachable began to write a new story, one step, one breath, one quiet miracle at a time. Blaze didn't change overnight. Miracles rarely unfold that way. But something in him had shifted during the storm, like a tight knot had come undone somewhere deep inside, one that had been choking him since the day helicopters chased his herd across the plains. He still spooked at loud noises, still kept his distance from anyone who wasn't Lily, still stood stiff as stone when Tom brought him feed. But the wild panic had dulled. His eyes didn't roll white at every movement. His body didn't bristle with fight or flight the moment a human came near. And, most notably, every morning, without fail, he stood waiting at the front of his paddock, waiting for her. Lily, for her part, changed in ways that couldn't be explained on paper. She didn't suddenly become talkative. She didn't return to school with big smiles or leap into conversation with her grandfather at dinner. But the fog had lifted. The invisible wall that had separated her from the world began to crumble, piece by silent piece. She started by humming, not just to Blaze now, but around the house, softly under her breath as she washed her hands or fed the barn cats. Then came words, quiet ones, sparse but deliberate. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Tom never commented when she spoke, never made a fuss or widened his eyes. He just nodded, responded in kind, and let her lead. And Blaze let her lead too. What began as tentative steps, one soft touch to his muzzle, one brush stroke across his back, soon became a rhythm. Lily learned how to stand beside him without being a threat, how to walk the perimeter of his paddock with him, following just a few steps behind, how to brush the dried mud from his flank without flinching when his skin twitched beneath her fingers. Each day brought a new first. The first time she halted him, the first time she clipped on a lead rope, the first time she led him from the paddock to the round pen, with Tom trailing a good 20 feet behind just in case. Blaze had never let anyone lead him before, not once, and yet with Lily he followed. Tom watched from the barn, barely breathing, as his granddaughter moved the Mustang in slow arcs inside the pen. She wasn't giving commands, she wasn't forcing anything. She simply walked, and he walked with her. Sometimes she'd stop, and he would pause beside her, waiting, ears twitching. Other times he'd grow anxious and trot ahead, but one glance from Lily and he would circle back, matching her pace again. It was a dance, silent and fluid, built not on dominance or submission, but on trust. Real, hard-earned trust. Tom tried not to get ahead of himself. He knew how fragile progress could be. One bad scare, one misstep, and a horse like Blaze could backslide into weeks or months of undoing. But Lily understood that better than anyone. She never pushed, never asked for more than he could give. She let Blaze set the pace, and in doing so, he began to let her guide it. One morning, about a week after the storm, Lily brought a saddle pad to the pen. Not a saddle, not even a bareback rig, just a soft wool blanket with worn edges and the smell of sun-baked leather. Blaze tensed the moment he saw it. His nostrils flared, his hooves shifted nervously. But Lily didn't move closer. She just set the pad on the ground, walked away, and sat down in the shade. It stayed there all morning. Blaze snorted at it a few times, approached, backed off, and finally, after a long internal debate only he could understand, he sniffed it. The next day she brought it again. This time she picked it up and let him watch her carry it. She walked around the pen with it folded over her arm, never aiming it at him, never sneaking up. And when she finally set it on his back, she did it so slowly that Tom thought time itself might stop watching her. Blaze flinched. His muscles went tight. But he didn't bolt. He didn't rear. He stood there, shaking slightly, and then he exhaled, a long, deep breath that fogged the air in front of him as though letting out something old and heavy. Lily stroked his neck. "Good boy," she whispered, almost inaudibly. Then she removed the pad and gave him a carrot. Just one. He took it gently from her hand, lips tickling her palm. Each new step came with that same care. Repetition, patience, permission, no shortcuts, no expectations. One morning she rubbed a curry comb over his withers. The next she cleaned his hooves. Tom showed her how, guiding her hand once, then letting her try alone. Blaze shifted, but didn't resist. Then came the lead line exercises, walking together across the pasture behind the barn. Blaze learned to stop when Lily stopped, to turn when she turned, to yield without pressure. The biggest test came a few days later. Tom had been working near the main gate, fixing a hinge with a loud, whining drill, when the sound kicked up and Blaze spooked. He bolted, but instead of fleeing blindly, he veered toward the fence, hesitated, and looked for Lily. She wasn't far. She stepped into his line of sight, lifted her hand, not commanding, just present, and that was enough. Blaze slowed. He didn't calm entirely, but he didn't spiral. He came back, not to Tom, to her. That night, Lily sat at the kitchen table with her sketchbook open and her pencil dancing in swift, confident strokes. Tom passed behind her and glanced down, curious. It wasn't Blaze's face this time. It was a drawing of her own hand resting on the side of his neck, drawn from memory, from feeling. And in the Mustang's eyes, she'd captured something Tom recognized immediately: peace. The sanctuary felt different now, lighter. The other horses responded to the new energy, growing calmer, more curious. Blaze's presence no longer triggered chaos. He was part of the herd, even if he remained apart. And Lily, she'd found her rhythm again. She helped with feedings, walked the fence lines with Tom, even laughed softly when the barn cats fought over her cereal one morning. But the moment that changed everything, the one that marked the real turning point, came one afternoon when Lily and Tom stood outside the round pen. Blaze was grazing inside, calm and content. Tom rested his arms on the rail and said, half to himself, "Hard to believe that horse was supposed to be dead 2 weeks ago." Lily looked at him, not with fear or confusion, with certainty. "He's not dead," she said. "He's just starting over." And in that sentence Tom heard everything she couldn't say in the year before. All the pain, all the loss, all the unspoken fears, but also the fight to keep going, the decision to stay, just like Blaze had stayed. When most would have run, he had chosen to remain still, and when everyone else had given up on him, Lily had simply sat down and listened. They were more than horse and girl now. They were reflections, and in saving him, Lily had begun to save herself. Not through grand gestures or breakthroughs shouted from rooftops, but through quiet mornings, muddy boots, and one small act of trust after another. The invitation came tucked inside a plain envelope, no different in appearance than the usual stack of flyers, feed bills, and dusty local newsletters Tom pulled from the mailbox every week. But the return address caught his eye: Montana State Horse Council. He opened it on the porch, the late summer breeze fluttering the paper as he unfolded it. The words were simple, but they carried weight. They'd heard about Blaze, about Lily, about the improbable bond between a girl who'd lost her voice and a Mustang who had lost his trust. Word had traveled faster than Tom expected, through whispers in horse circles and quiet articles shared in rural feed stores and veterinary clinics. The council was inviting them to demonstrate at the upcoming state fair, an educational showcase, they said, not a performance, not a spectacle, a story, a chance to show the healing power of patience and connection and what it looked like when you gave the broken a second chance. Tom read it twice. Then he looked out toward the paddock, where Lily was sitting beneath the cottonwood tree, with Blaze's halter lying beside her in the grass. The Mustang stood nearby, not tethered, not confined, just close, always close. He grazed peacefully, lifting his head every so often to check on her, like he needed to know she was still there. And she was, every day. She'd barely missed a sunrise since the storm. He waited until evening to tell her, after chores, after dinner, after Blaze had been brushed down and his stall filled with fresh hay. Lily was sitting at the kitchen table sketching again, this time a rough outline of the sanctuary's layout. She was starting to draw it from memory now, labeling things quietly in the margins, like someone planning more than just pictures, like someone planning a life. Tom took a breath, handed her the invitation, and waited. Lily read it slowly. Her face gave little away, as always, but her fingers trembled slightly as they held the edge of the page. When she reached the end, she looked up, her eyes searching his. "You don't have to do it," Tom said gently. "We can say no. We can stay right here, where it's safe." Lily didn't respond with words. Instead, she slid the paper back across the table, then opened her sketchbook to a clean page. She drew two figures, a girl and a horse, standing side by side beneath a sign that read, "State Fair." She handed it back, nodding once. And just like that, they had a new goal. Preparing for the fair wasn't easy. Tom had worked horses his whole life, but this was different. This wasn't about teaching tricks or executing a flawless routine. It was about helping two living beings, one human, one equine, step into a new kind of vulnerability. Crowds, noise, applause, all the things that used to make Blaze bolt and Lily retreat, but neither of them was who they used to be, and neither wanted to turn back. Maya, a trainer from a neighboring ranch who'd always had a soft spot for rescues, offered to help. She'd been watching from a distance, fascinated by the progress but careful not to interfere. Now, with the fair on the horizon, she stepped in to guide the more technical aspects. Not training Blaze in the traditional sense, he still wouldn't tolerate pressure or commands, but desensitization, exposure, trust exercises. Lily was involved in every part of it. She didn't just lead Blaze through the drills, she designed them. When Maya suggested waving flags or playing recordings of crowd noise, it was Lily who decided how loud, how close, how long. She paid attention to Blaze's breathing, his posture, his smallest reactions. She knew him, knew when to stop, when to push, when to wait. The first time they brought out a loudspeaker, Blaze flinched so violently that he nearly knocked over the gate. But Lily didn't panic. She didn't back away. She stood her ground, made herself small again, and began humming that same lullaby from the storm. Within minutes, Blaze had stopped trembling, and by the next day, he let the speaker play in the background without a single flinch. They practiced leading through cones, walking beside crowds of volunteers, tolerating unfamiliar smells and sounds. Blaze startled at almost every new stimulus, but every time Lily was there, and every time he returned to her. Over and over she proved the world could be loud and still be safe, that people could be unpredictable and still be kind, that new didn't always mean danger. And Lily, she was changing too. She spoke more freely now, softly, yes, but consistently. She laughed. She gave Tom updates on Blaze's progress without prompting. She started making lists of supplies they'd need for the trip: carrots, lead ropes, extra brushes, and the blanket her mother had given her the Christmas before the accident. "It smells like home," she said one evening, folding it carefully and tucking it into Blaze's travel bag. The night before they were scheduled to leave, Tom sat on the porch watching the sky fade into violet. Lily joined him with 2 mugs of warm milk, one for each of them. "Are you nervous?" he asked after a long stretch of silence. She nodded slowly, then said, "But not scared." Tom smiled. "There's a difference, isn't there?" Lily looked out toward the barn, where Blaze stood in the open doorway, watching the night settle in. "He'll be okay," she whispered. "We both will." And for the first time in a long time, Tom believed it. At dawn, the trailer was packed. Blaze loaded without protest, the ramp clunking beneath his hooves, but not stopping his forward motion. He paused once, turned his head toward the barn as if taking one last look, then stepped inside. Lily followed him in, checked the straw, the water, the latches. She whispered something only he could hear, then gave Tom a thumbs up. No hesitation, no fear. As the truck pulled away from the sanctuary, Lily looked out the window, watching the familiar fences fade into the distance. Her home, her beginning, and now a new chapter waiting at the end of a long road. She didn't need to ask Blaze if he was ready. He already was, and so was she. They arrived at the state fairgrounds just after sunrise, the Montana sky painted in soft pinks and bruised purples, the air crisp with the scent of alfalfa, sawdust, and morning dew. It was quieter than Tom expected. Vendors setting up booths, banners being strung between wooden poles, volunteers directing trailers to designated stalls. But even in the early calm, there was a hum beneath it all. A tension, anticipation building like steam in a kettle. The kind of energy that could either lift you up or unravel everything you'd worked for. Blaze stepped off the trailer with hesitant feet, his nostrils flaring as he took in the new surroundings. The sharp smell of diesel, the clanging of metal gates, the sudden laughter from a nearby group of kids. It all came at him in waves, too fast, too unfamiliar. He tensed, his muscles twitching under his glossy brown coat, ears flicking in every direction. But then Lily stepped out behind him, holding the lead rope lightly in her hand, and the Mustang turned his head toward her like a ship finding its lighthouse. He blinked, snorted once, and then he followed. Tom watched them from a few paces back, hands clenched in the deep pockets of his jacket. This was it, the culmination of everything. Every early morning, every moment of doubt, every sketch, every scar, every whisper between a child and a wild horse. But now it was real. They were no longer in their secluded sanctuary. This was the world, a world with judges and strangers and noise that couldn't be softened by kindness. And yet somehow Lily walked through it as if none of that mattered. They brought Blaze to a temporary stall at the far end of the demonstration arena, a quieter corner flanked by hay bales and shaded fencing. Lily let him settle, brushing his coat gently, whispering reassurances under her breath. Blaze shifted from foot to foot at first, tossing his head, clearly unsure, but not panicked. Not the wild-eyed, fence-slamming animal they'd once feared he would always be. He didn't eat at first, but after a while, with Lily sitting just outside the stall humming softly, he lowered his head and began to nibble the hay she'd set out. Small wins, that's what Tom kept reminding himself. One at a time. They spent the morning walking the fairgrounds, first just Lily and Blaze, then with Tom and Maya nearby for support. The crowd was still light, but growing. Families drifted past, children pointing, whispering in awe at the sight of a girl leading a Mustang with no saddle, no whip, no tension in the rope between them, just trust. Volunteers paused to watch. Vendors stepped out from behind their booths. There was something magnetic about the pair, something that made people go quiet for a second without realizing it. By noon, word had spread. The story had legs now. A girl who hadn't spoken in a year. A wild Mustang destined for slaughter. And now both of them were walking through the busiest event in the state like they belonged. Like they were the calm in the storm. A reporter from a regional paper stopped Tom near the barn entrance. "Do you think it's true?" she asked, tapping her notepad. "That she saved him?" Tom looked past her to where Lily stood beside Blaze, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as a group of schoolchildren leaned on the fence to get a better look. Blaze didn't shy away. He didn't rear. He stood solid, letting their awe wash over him like wind. "No," Tom said. "I don't think it. I know it." The demonstration was scheduled for 3 p.m. in the main arena between the riding competitions and the rescue adoption showcase. By 2:30, the stands were already half full. Organizers had originally planned to give Lily and Blaze 10 minutes, maybe 15, but with the growing crowd, murmurs of media attention, and a sudden spike in attendance at the information booth for wild horse rehabilitation, they were asked if they'd be comfortable extending to a full half hour. Tom looked at Lily, unsure, but she simply nodded, calm and unshaken. When the time came, she led Blaze into the arena like she was walking down a familiar trail back home. The bleachers buzzed with chatter, phones lifted, cameras clicked. But inside that ring, it might as well have been just the two of them. Blaze's ears twitched, his head stayed high, but his body moved with intention. Every step matched Lily's. Every pause was mirrored. She didn't need a microphone or a trainer's shout to guide him. She walked in wide circles, stopping occasionally to brush him, to lift one hoof, to guide him through simple maneuvers they'd practiced 100 times under cottonwood trees and morning mist. And then, without cue or fanfare, She dropped the lead rope. The gasp from the crowd rippled like a gust of wind, but Blaze didn't bolt. He didn't even flinch. He stayed rooted beside her, nostrils flaring only slightly, his body loose and alert, like a soldier standing at ease beside his captain. Lily took 3 steps forward. Blaze followed. She turned right. So did he. No commands, no reins, just faith. When they stopped in the center of the arena, Lily reached into her jacket and pulled out a small sketch. Blaze's eyes, drawn in incredible detail, with hers reflected in them. She held it up without saying a word. A volunteer brought her a microphone, but she hesitated. Then she looked down at Blaze, back at the crowd, and spoke. "Everyone told us he was dangerous," she said, her voice quiet but sure, "that he'd never be safe, that he'd never change. But he wasn't dangerous. He was scared, just like I was." Silence. People asked how I did it, but I didn't fix him. I didn't make him better. I just listened. I let him be scared, and little by little, he let me be scared too. She looked at Blaze again, eyes full of something older than her age. We saved each other. When they left the arena, the crowd rose in a standing ovation. Not for tricks, not for performance, but for something far rarer. Truth. Raw, unscripted truth. Reporters pushed forward with questions, but Lily simply smiled and walked on. Blaze at her side, calm, steady, free. Back at the stall, Tom wrapped his arms around her shoulders and held her for a long moment. No words, none needed. And as the fairgrounds buzzed with stories of the girl and the Mustang, as their picture made its way across social media and headlines and hearts, Lily sat on a bale of straw beside Blaze, who rested his chin gently on her shoulder. Neither of them had planned to become anything special, but by simply choosing to trust each other in a world that gave up too easily, they'd become something more than any headline could capture. They had become a living reminder that healing isn't loud, it's quiet, it's slow, and it's shared. By the time they returned from the fair, the sanctuary felt different. Not physically. It was still the same patchwork of fences and stalls, the same weathered barn with tools lined up like soldiers, the same familiar trails winding behind the ridge. But something beneath the surface had shifted. Word had spread far beyond their small valley. The story of a silent girl and a so-called dangerous Mustang had traveled on more than just headlines. It had burrowed its way into hearts. Letters began arriving, first a trickle, then a stream, envelopes addressed to Lily and Blaze, stuffed with handwritten notes from people who saw the demonstration and hadn't stopped thinking about it since. Children who'd lost pets, veterans battling trauma, grandparents who couldn't reach their own grandchildren. They all said the same thing. Your story made me believe again. Tom read every single one. Some he read aloud. Some he simply handed to Lily, letting her take them to the paddock where she'd sit cross-legged with Blaze and go through them one by one. She didn't speak much about what they meant to her, but her face said enough. And the drawing she made afterward, Blaze surrounded by light, Blaze walking through doorways with children behind him, Blaze as a bridge between two cliffs, revealed more than any conversation could have. But letters weren't the only thing that changed. People started showing up. Not tourists, not gawkers, but people who needed something they didn't quite know how to name. A father drove 4 hours with his son, who hadn't spoken since a house fire the year before. A teacher from Helena brought 2 students with behavioral diagnoses she felt unequipped to handle. A young woman, freshly out of rehab, arrived with a backpack, a sketch pad, and more questions than she could ask out loud. They all came for the same reason, though none said it plainly. They came because they'd seen what was possible when the world stopped expecting and simply allowed. When someone, human or horse, was met with patience instead of pressure. Tom was overwhelmed at first. The sanctuary wasn't a clinic. It wasn't equipped for therapy. But what it did have, he realized, was space. It had quiet. It had rhythm. And most of all, it had Lily and Blaze, who continued to move through their days with the same unshakable bond, grounded in trust and shaped by silence. Blaze now roamed with more freedom, but always circled back to Lily. He still didn't care for strangers, and he didn't pretend to, but when Lily was near, he tolerated their presence. Sometimes he even seemed to understand that these visitors, like him, were figuring out how to exist in a world that hadn't been gentle. Dr. Miller returned a few days after the fair, not just to observe, but with a proposal that left Tom stunned. The university wanted to establish a research partnership. They'd fund facility improvements, offer staff support, and document the long-term impacts of equine-assisted trauma recovery, using Lily and Blaze as the cornerstone case. "You've done something no textbook ever has," she said, her eyes shining as she watched Lily lead Blaze through the pasture, their steps in perfect sync. "You didn't force change. You created the conditions for it. That's more valuable than anything I could publish." Tom didn't answer right away. He wasn't used to being seen as the beginning of anything. Most of his life had been about fixing what others gave up on. Broken horses, broken fences, broken hopes. But the idea of expanding their impact, of giving others the same sanctuary that had saved his granddaughter, began to settle into his mind like a new seed, full of quiet potential. Lily, meanwhile, had started writing again. She'd taken to keeping a journal, something Olivia Parker, the trauma therapist, gently encouraged. At first, it was just single words, then short lines. Now full paragraphs spilled onto the pages, thoughts about Blaze, about grief, about strength. She still wasn't a chatterbox, and probably never would be, but her voice, now that it had returned, came with intention. She used it sparingly, but when she spoke, it carried weight, especially when she spoke to Blaze. Their relationship had deepened in ways that defied explanation. Blaze responded to her even when she wasn't touching the lead. A slight hand movement, a shift in her breath, even her presence outside the barn seemed to influence his mood. It was as if they existed in the same frequency now, a shared rhythm that didn't need translation. And Tom, who had once questioned if either of them would ever heal, now watched them with awe, understanding at last that healing wasn't about forgetting what broke you. It was about learning how to live with it together. Claire Wilson visited more frequently too. Since the fair, she'd become something of a partner, offering organizational help, bringing in donations, coordinating with local schools to arrange field trips. One afternoon, she arrived with news. "The state education department wants to know if we'd be open to turning this place into an accredited learning site. Equine studies, trauma recovery, youth programs." She trailed off, looking out toward the pasture where Lily was sketching while Blaze grazed nearby. "They see something here, Jack. So do I." Tom, still unused to the idea of long-term plans, grunted, half skeptical, half impressed. "We're just a small place with a few rescue horses and a girl who doesn't like crowds." Claire smiled. "Exactly, and that's why it works, because it's not about the crowds, it's about connection." That night, Tom and Lily sat on the porch under a blanket, the stars above them bright and humming. Blaze stood by the fence just within sight, his silhouette peaceful, the kind of stillness that comes from knowing you're safe. Tom turned to Lily, who was writing something in her journal. "You ever think we'd end up here?" She paused, then looked out into the dark where Blaze flicked his tail once and lowered his head to graze. "Not here," she said. "Somewhere better." Tom felt a tightness in his throat, the kind that came from gratitude so big it had nowhere else to go. He reached out and took her hand gently, her fingers ink-stained and strong. "It's been a long road." Lily nodded, then whispered, "But we're still walking it. Together." And they were. No longer survivors clinging to each other in the aftermath, but pioneers of something new. A place where the wounded weren't discarded, where trust was built one breath at a time, where a girl and a horse proved that broken didn't mean beyond repair. It simply meant there was work to be done, work worth doing, together. The first snow came early that year. It wasn't the heavy, clinging kind that coated fences in thick blankets or bent tree limbs low with its weight. It was light, hesitant, like the sky was testing the ground's readiness to change. Tiny flakes spiraled down in lazy circles, dusting the paddock rails and collecting in the folds of Blaze's mane as he stood just beyond the barn, perfectly still, his breath rising in soft clouds against the pale morning air. Inside the farmhouse, Lily pressed her forehead to the cold windowpane, watching him, her fingers curled around a warm mug of tea. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Tom sat at the table behind her, reading a letter from the university confirming that the grant funding had been approved. Construction on the new therapy barn would begin in the spring. So much had happened in the months since the fair, but it hadn't rushed in the way fame often does. It came gently, like healing had taught them it must. A steady stream of small victories, an outpouring of support from people who'd seen what Lily and Blaze had done together and believed in what it could mean for others. A series of honest conversations about what the sanctuary could become, not just a place for broken horses, but for broken people, survivors, grievers, wanderers, those who didn't need fixing so much as a place to feel whole again. And yet, through it all, Lily and Blaze remained the same, grounded, present, true. They still spent their mornings walking the trails behind the ridge. Blaze didn't wear a halter anymore unless necessary. He followed her now without being asked, sometimes at her side, sometimes behind, but always near, always attentive. They had moved far beyond commands. Their communication was instinctive now, built from silence and small gestures, a language all their own. Sometimes they stopped by the creek, where Lily would sit on the flat rocks and draw while Blaze drank from the icy water or nuzzled at her shoulder for apples. Other times she would read aloud, her voice quiet, unforced, just words shared between two souls who no longer feared their own. Blaze had grown more accepting of others too, carefully, gradually. When new volunteers came to help at the sanctuary, he would keep his distance at first, but if Lily led the way, he followed. One child, a young boy named Cameron, had started coming with his foster mother every Thursday. He was 8, and like Lily, he didn't speak much, but Blaze took to him. The first time Cameron reached out a tentative hand, Blaze had stood patiently, letting the boy stroke his shoulder, as if he knew exactly what that small gesture cost him. Lily watched from the paddock gate, her heart aching in that beautiful way that comes when you realize someone else is walking a road you once thought was yours alone. As the days shortened and the air turned sharper, preparations for winter became part of the rhythm. Tom repaired fencing and insulated the barn. Claire and Maya took on organizing a community fundraiser, one meant not only to help feed the horses through the cold season, but to begin establishing a scholarship fund for families in need of equine-based therapy. Meanwhile, the university team began formal interviews with Tom and Lily, quietly documenting what they now called the Blaze method, a trauma-informed approach to equine human recovery based on presence, patience, and mutual choice. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't quick, but it was changing lives. One evening, as the first real snowstorm swept over the valley, Lily curled up on the living room couch with Blaze's old halter cradled in her lap. It had become a sort of relic now, not used in weeks, but too meaningful to pack away. She ran her fingers over the worn leather, remembering the first time she'd held it, the weight of fear and hope that had balanced in her chest like a seesaw. Tom came in from outside, snow in his beard, his hands stiff with cold, but his eyes soft when they landed on her. "He's settled in," he said. "Found his corner by the heater. Looks like he's not going anywhere." Lily smiled, then looked down at the halter. "Me neither." It was the kind of thing she said more often now, not grand proclamations, but simple truths that landed like anchors. She had stopped planning her escape from the pain. She'd stopped bracing for everything to fall apart. Instead, she had started planting herself into this life, this sanctuary, with the same care she used to brush Blaze's mane. Each word she spoke was like a seed pressed into thawing earth, and what bloomed from it was not the same girl Tom had taken in after the accident. It was someone new, still quiet, still tender, but no longer haunted, no longer hollow. The storm raged well into the night. winds howling through the trees, snow swirling thick across the pasture. At one point, a power flicker darkened the house for several long seconds. When the lights came back, Lily was already grabbing her coat. "He doesn't like the wind," she said, pulling on her boots. "It reminds him of the helicopters." Tom didn't argue. He just grabbed his own coat and followed. Outside, the world was blanketed in white, the sanctuary transformed into a quiet cathedral of snow and ice. Blaze stood at the far end of the paddock, his head low, ears flicking in agitation. But the moment he saw Lily, he stilled. She walked to him slowly, the snow crunching beneath her boots, her breath visible in the air. When she reached him, she pressed her forehead to his, her hands sliding along his neck. He let out a long sigh and leaned into her, the fear draining from his body like water into soil. They stayed that way for minutes, unmoving, the wind tugging at their jackets and manes. And when Tom saw that Blaze had calmed, he stepped back toward the barn to give them space. He didn't need to see the rest. He knew how it ended. With trust, with love, with Lily leading Blaze back through the snow toward the shelter they'd built together, both of them protected not by walls, but by each other. And as they disappeared into the warm glow spilling from the barn door, Tom felt something in his chest settle. The kind of peace that only comes after a long storm. The kind that says, yes, this was always worth it. Later that night, long after the storm had passed and the house had grown quiet, Lily sat at her desk, writing in her journal. She wrote about the snow, about the way Blaze had calmed the moment he saw her, about the way she had calmed the moment she touched him, and then, in small, careful letters, she wrote something she had not yet put on paper. "I don't feel broken anymore." She paused, stared at the sentence, and underlined it twice. Then she closed the journal and looked out at the sleeping sanctuary, the barn lights flickering through the snow, the silhouette of Blaze resting peacefully in his stall. Her heart was still tender, still healing, but it beat strong and sure in her chest now. She had found her place in the world, not in the noise, not in the spotlight, but here, in the quiet. And in the quiet, everything finally made sense.